Hey, what's going on, everybody? Justin here, and in this video we're going to be doing a book review of Septimius Severus in the Roman Army by Michael Sage. Pen and Sword Books was super kind and gave me a whole slew of kind of like Roman and Greek history books that I really need to get going on reading and actually reviewing and stuff. So we're going to be starting with Septimius Severus and the Roman Army. And usually how I do these reviews, even though I think I did one like last week, but before that, I think I've gone like a year without doing like individual reviews and stuff. I generally like to take care of kind of the negative aspects, I guess, real quick. Just so we end on a positive note and whatnot, stuff like that. So let's just go ahead and get started. This is mostly actually a bunch of kind of little nitpicky things with this title in the first place. But let's just go ahead and get started with that. First of all, is definitely going to be the writing style. And it's not necessarily that's a dry book. Like, a lot of people think academic books are real stuffy and whatnot. That's definitely not the case because, if anything, this is actually a very fast-paced book, considering it's kind of like a military political history, of a Roman emperor, during a time of expansion and whatnot. But every now and then, the author has these paragraphs where they're just really, like, a lot of short sentences that are very, like, punchy, I guess. It's like, for example, Severus did this, and then he sent his lieutenant to do that, and because they did this, this happened, and stuff like this. And it's not the whole book, but you can definitely tell that they're, like, kind of in there, and I don't know. To me, I didn't quite, like, it just felt a little jarring, so I mean, for some people that might be kind of a turn-off type of thing, but it's definitely not the whole book, and like I said, it's not like a stuffy, dry read, per se. The next thing is with the subtitle Septimius Severus and the Roman Army. You kind of think that there'd be a lot of, parts about the Roman army in particular, and kind of Severus's kind of like dealings with the Roman army and how he changed or reformed it or something like that. And that's definitely in the book, but unfortunately, even though it's kind of like a military history, the Roman army part is almost more, I shouldn't say it's almost more, it literally is like kind of like a 10 or 12 page appendix at the back of the book, kind of dealing specifically with how Severus, changed the Roman army and kind of instituted some different reforms, such as a little bit increasing the size and pay of the Roman legionaries and stuff. Actually, a lot of dealings with auxiliary units, which I actually thought was really cool. For example, other things like he was the first emperor that began stationing an actual Roman legion in the province of Italy itself, whereas before I think it was just sort of the Praetorian Guards, which, in the book, we're kind of dealing with the Praetorians kind of killing emperors left and right, kind of before Septimius takes kind of care of that and says, you guys are kind of like, oh, dismissed, you guys suck, basically, and kind of makes his own new Praetorian Guard and whatnot. But anyways, like I said, it's kind of more of like an appendix rather than just sort of like a emphasis throughout the book, so that was kind of a little weird. And then one more thing, which I don't think really is the author's fault, but I do believe some of these books do really well with plates, and there are no illustrated plates with like photographs or images or anything like that in this book, and I think that could have actually helped a little bit. Just for example, one of the sort of was like kind of like triumphal monuments that Septimius Severus the emperor made, was called the Septa Zodium in the city of Rome, and it was this reading about it, it was just like this weird, apparently just not a triumphal archway, but it was like a building made into 7 parts and stuff, and I really wasn't getting it, so I had to look it up online and stuff, and there were like drawings and things of what people think kind of like the facade looked like and whatnot. But it was just like kind of this monumental piece of architecture that sounded really cool in the book, but I just could not like visualize what was going on there without looking at it myself. So I do think some plates probably would have helped, but those are the kind of like the negative, like small things just to keep in mind when reading this book. But there are definitely a lot more positives than negatives, and that's for sure. First of all, like I kind of mentioned earlier, it's actually a pretty fast-paced book in the sense of, we're dealing with Septimius Severus, for those who don't know, became emperor fairly early on in 193 CE. And just for a little bit of backstory, which the book does really well, actually dealing with sort of the kind of prelude to, it's called the Year of the Five Emperors. 193 is because there was literally five emperors during that year, or at least 5 contenders for the throne. But essentially, after Marcus Aurelius dies, we have Commodus, and we all know Commodus was pretty much a terrible emperor for a couple of years. He's off by the Praetorian Guards. Pertinax is installed. The Praetorians also hate him, kind of off him as well. Like 3 months into his reign, Didius Julianus steps in and literally wins the emperorship in an auction, and a bunch of basically other contenders, Septimius Severus, Pescennius Niger, and Clodius Albinus. Albinus being in Britain and Niger being in Syria. All basically saying, nah, I'm just gonna like step in and avenge Pertinax and Didius Julianus and all that, Pertinax, and become the emperor myself. Septimius Severus, the book deals with sort of how he wins kind of this giant civil war, taking out Niger first, kind of making a deal with Albinus, but you know, deals like that just like aren't gonna like last, so they come to blows a couple years later. And sort of how Septimius Severus, you know, eventually installs himself as, you know, kind of the last man standing after the year of the 5 emperors. So we're dealing with a whole lot of stuff, and even after he becomes emperor, Septimius Severus, kind of like Trajan, it definitely expands the borders of the Roman Empire at the height, pretty much at the apogee of its power. You see, he fought wars out in the Middle East, gaining a province near Mesopotamia, expanded the borders maybe a little bit in kind of the African provinces, and also made inroads in Britain. So, like I said, he's got a lot going on, which is actually kind of interesting because the author definitely describes how he was definitely more of just sort of an administrator type person. His whole career before, you know, marching on the throne and taking the emperorship was pretty lackluster and had almost like no military experience, like, so to speak. So I thought it was actually really interesting how sort of the kind of administrative type, you know, was able to sort of, you know, lead from the back and actually gather, you know, important people around him to make sure things, kind of like Augustus, how he had Agrippa and stuff like that. But anyways, like I said, book is actually fairly fast paced. So it's definitely not a dry read, which I think for most people, that's definitely a plus, especially dealing with sort of history books and things like that. What I also like is how the author sets up the book. Dealing with Septimius Severus is he's known as sort of the African emperor, because he was actually born in Leptis Magna, which would be in roughly the province of Libya. Well, I mean the country of Libya today, but I can't remember if the Romans actually called it the province of Libya or something. Anyways, pretty close to Tripoli today. And he kind of deals with, or he explains how during this time period in the late 2nd century CE, a lot of like Gallic senators are coming about, a lot of high-ranking officials are coming from Africa. You know, the empire is starting to, you know, become much more cosmopolitan in nature, and that's definitely described throughout the book. I thought that was just, you know, really cool how he's bringing in sort of, even though it's, you know, it's a military history per se, it definitely is including kind of like other kind of cultural, social background stuff, kind of leading the way to how Septimius Severus was even in the position, being born in, you know, Libya, how he was even, you know, able to make a stab, I guess, at the emperorship, stuff like that. So, yeah, like I said, overall, definitely, it's a really good history book. Oh, one of the most important things that I really enjoyed about the book, even though the book uses footnotes at the end of the book rather than endnotes, excuse me, he uses endnotes instead of footnotes. I prefer footnotes just so I can like look down while I'm reading and stuff. The footnotes are actually really good because throughout the text of the book, the author does a perfect job. This is probably one of the best strengths, I think, of the author here, is the author does a perfect job kind of overturning just enough stones, like when there's like controversy or kind of, you know, unknowns, or when scholars aren't really sure exactly, you know, what happened or which kind of track to take when there are competing theories or competing accounts in the primary sources, which are not great considering we have Cassius Dio, Herodian, and the notoriously awful Historia Augusta. For those who like know classical history, that primary text is just, you know, dealing with that, you gotta like touch it with like a 6 foot pole just to make sure, you know, you're getting anything out of it. But anyways, the author overturns just like the perfect amount of, you know, I guess questionable stuff and kind of making sort of judgment calls on like, you know, what he actually thinks happened. But then you can go in the footnotes. Oftentimes he'll have endnote. I keep saying footnotes. He has endnotes where he kind of explains a little bit further on like where you can like read it in the primary source or like what other scholars have to say on it, and where he kind of disagrees, you know, I guess more strongly, or agrees more strongly on different things, stuff like that. So the text itself is very like legible, and then he kind of, you know, goes into the weeds more often in the endnotes, which is definitely the best way to do it. A lot of history books when dealing with like really specific stuff or really controversial things or things that have a lot of kind of like unknowns and variables and whatnot. You know, if they go into the weeds too much, the text just bogs down and it's just terrible. But he does a great job dealing with that in the appropriate manner. And kind of on the same topic, the endnotes are really good. He has like kind of all his primary source references in there as well. His bibliography is tremendous. He has kind of a brief little general bibliography, but then he has a huge bibliography for each of like the dozen or so chapters throughout the book, and kind of just like going through it. It's filled with a lot of actual, other books and stuff, as well as like kind of academic journals. Because sometimes the bibliography can get really esoteric with like, multi-language, just like, academic journal articles and stuff, which, for I think the vast majority of readers just, doesn't help unless you're already like a scholar in the field and whatnot. But anyways, I'm definitely adding a few books from the bibliography to my TBR. So overall, this, like I said, definitely a great book. I hope anyone who's kind of interested in the Severan dynasty, which is sort of the last stable period before, the crisis of the 3rd century, I think this is definitely a good book to kind of get into. I think historically, just from like everything else that I've read, Septimius Severus sort of gets I guess, maybe not a bad rep per se, but, he's considered kind of, it's definitely skewed more negative. The author does a good job kind of, balancing the line where, yeah, he screwed this up, for example, raising his kids, Geta and Caracalla, and kind of, setting the stage that for Caracalla to basically off Geta, even though that obviously wasn't his intention or anything like that. He definitely didn't really go out of his way too much to kind of, help kind of balance that out a little bit. So he definitely points out the faults, but he definitely points out a lot of the good stuff as well. Mostly being that Severus was actually a pretty stable, pretty, I guess, just normal, I don't know what the word is, I guess, kind of grounded ruler. Like, he wasn't super ostentatious. He wasn't super into, like, all the crazy, like, luxury stuff that a lot of Roman emperors were, and, he kind of set the stage to, at least for, like, 40 years or so, the Severan dynasty is able to hold things kind of together before, just the absolute implosion that was the crisis of the 3rd century. But anyways, if you're interested, in Roman emperors, the Roman Empire, the High Roman Empire, anything like that, definitely give this book a look. I think you will enjoy it. I learned a ton from it. I know you guys all will too. So thank you so much to Pen and Sword for sending me this as well. And thank you so much for watching this far into the video. If you have, definitely check out my Twitter, Instagram. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Leave some comments down below about who your favorite Roman emperor is, if you have one. Let me know. I'd like to talk to everyone about stuff like that. And definitely check out the Etsy shop as well. It's the best way to support the channel. And always remember, whether you're reading about the Roman Empire or not, read victoriously.